Dear learners, welcome back to the third session of the fourth week. And in this, we would be discussing the techniques of budgeting. And this is very important to understand what is required to prepare a budget. We have discussed the concept of budget, different types of budget, the classification related to the budget based on time, the capacity, the functions. Now we'll come to the another important aspect of budgeting, that is the techniques of budgeting. When we talk about the budgeting, we need to be very clear about the objectives of the organization for a particular year. Because usually when we talk about making a budget, it is the master budget and that is made for a year. Apart from that, the short-term budgets are also there. But one has to know that what is the goal of the organization within that particular year. What does it want to achieve? How does it want to achieve, what kind of expenses it requires, and if it is say an NGO, so what kind of funding would be there, how the funding would be gathered, what kind of income generation activities would be there. So everything should be very clear. There should be clarity about the goals of the organization. For profit-making organization, of course, profit maximization is the main objective. So we are not talking about that particular concept. But for an NGO, expanding the reach to distant villages or the remote areas or towards more people is the main objective. And for an NGO, it is important to be useful for the society, for the welfare of the society. It is important for the NGO to expand. How will it do it? So it requires certain kinds of funds. So it is always proper to be very specific in stating the objectives, and after defining the objectives, the key factors or the limiting factors, they need to be ascertained so that a proper budget can be prepared. When we prepare a budget, we need to ascertain the organization's objectives and goals. That is the first part. In process of preparing budget, the first step is to ensure that what are the objectives and goals of the organization. The second aspect is trying to determine the constraints for the organization. Third step is checking the availability of the funds. The fourth step is estimating the costs of the organization, and estimating the future revenue of the organization becomes the fifth step. So it is the cost, it's the revenue, and the final step is preparing the budget. So this is the whole process of preparing a budget. Finding out the objective and goals of the organization, the constraints, the funds available, the costs, the revenues, and then the budget is prepared. Now, there are different types of techniques which are very important for the organization while preparing a budget. These techniques can be basically of four kinds, and basically these kinds of techniques, they are used by the corporate houses. But some of the activities or some of the techniques can be used for NGOs also. The first technique is incremental budgeting. The second one is the activity-based budgeting. The third one is the zero-based budgeting. And the fourth one is value proposition budgeting. We'll see these activities or techniques one by one. When we talk about incremental budgeting, this kind of budgeting is based on the last year's actual income and expenditure, and it involves taking last year's actual figures and adding or subtracting a certain percentage to obtain the current year's figures. It is useful where primary cost drivers remain unchanged for a long period of time. Usually incremental budgeting is done for all kinds of organization because this is a basic form of budgeting. So whenever you use the last year's figure to prepare the current year budget, the incremental budgeting comes handy and it is useful. And in specific cases like NGOs, then incremental budgeting are useful for preparing a budget. These are some of the benefits of incremental budgeting. It is the most common method of budgeting, as I talked about. It is simple, it is easy to understand, and it does not require in-depth knowledge. So it becomes easy to prepare that kind of a budget. It prevents the conflict between different managers of different functional areas, as same approach is adopted throughout the organization, and time required for preparing an incremental budget is comparatively less because it is based on the previous year's budget. But there are certain disadvantages as well, or certain kinds of problems arising out of incremental budgeting. Incremental budgeting can lead to a situation of over budgeting or under budgeting. See, if you're taking a previous year's budget in account, so if there is a deficit, you might increase the cost kind of a thing, and the budget may be over budgeted. And if you see the surpluses, you may reduce the amount, and then it comes out to be under budgeting. And there is less scope for cost control, and it overlooks the inflation of the cost. Risks of including activities which might not be needed in the current year because it is based on the previous year's budget. So these are some of the problems which arise out of incremental budgeting. Now coming to the another kind of technique which is known as activity-based budgeting, and it is usually known as top-down budgeting approach, and it involves setting a targeted output and then determining the level of input for achieving the desired output. Usually under this technique, the cost is estimated for all the activities which are required to be undertaken for achievement of desired output. As the name suggests, it is activity-based budgeting. That means all kinds of activities related to the organization and the expenses, the costs and the revenues related to those activities are being included in that particular kind of a budget. Now when we talk about activity-based budget, now these are the steps: the desired level of output, identifying the activities, and estimating the costs of the activities. So first you need to see what is the desired level of output, then you try to identify the activities based on that, and then you try to estimate the cost of those activities, and accordingly then prepare the budget. These are some of the advantages of activity-based budgeting. It leads to better cost containment. Cost control is beneficial, or you can have a better cost control in activity-based budgeting because the cost of each activity is accounted for. And another importance is that it tries to link different activities of management and thus provides a bigger picture of the organization or a broader picture of the organization. It helps in eliminating redundancy of activities by evaluating the activities against each other. Now in this case, what happens specifically for NGOs, what happens, certain activities may not be required. And for that, if we prepare an incremental budget, then what happens is that those redundant activities are also included. But when we go in for activity-based budget, those activities can be removed and only those activities can be considered which are not redundant, which are important for the organization and which are going to generate certain kind of revenue for the organization. There are certain drawbacks of this activity-based budgeting. So you all know that there are pros and cons involved with each and everything. Even with an individual or a human being, nobody is perfect. So there are pros and cons involved, or there are certain kind of flaws available with different kinds of techniques. Now when we talk about the drawbacks or the disadvantages of activity-based budgeting, you will find that more of the focus is only on the activities than on the actual organizational goals. So that means only the activities are considered and the long-term goals of the organization are missed out. the single activity may attract all the resources, and then what happens? The cost is incurred in only one activity, and the other activities or other functional organizations, they suffer. So managers, they require a deep understanding. This requires in-depth knowledge and deep understanding of activities to assess their cost. And it is a very long process. It is a time-consuming process. So when we talk about activity-based budgeting, it is important for the organization, but the budget should not only be based on activities. It has to include other resources as well. Now coming to another technique, that is the value proposition budget. It is based on the assumption that every item which is included in the budget, it holds some value for the organization. It gives answers to the questions why any activity should be undertaken, and it aims to avoid unnecessary expenditure which holds no value to the organization and its stakeholders. Now, if you just go back and you see that in activity-based budgeting, we said that the redundant activities have been discarded and only those activities have been considered which are important for the organization. But when we talk about the value proposition budget, in this case, we try to find out that even if the activities is important for the organization, that means it is useful for the organization, but is it creating any kind of a value? Why any activity should be undertaken? It is important for the organization, but why? Why is it important? That needs to be understood. Just with the name of the activity, we cannot say that it is important. So the assumption that it is holding a value to the organization, that is important, and we need to know or understand why any activity should be undertaken. It aims to avoid all the unnecessary expenditures which holds no value to the organization and its stakeholders. The following questions, they are considered by the budget officer before making the budget, or if it is a value proposition budgeting. And these questions are, what is the need for an item which is to be included in the budget? Whether this item is of any value for its stakeholders, that is important, not only for the organization but also for the stakeholders. Whether the value of the item justifies the cost to acquire the item, that is important to understand. These are some of the advantages of value proposition budgeting. It helps in identifying the activities which holds value for the target audience and hence giving competitive advantage to the organization. It also helps the organization on focusing on only those activities which has more value than the cost. It helps in reducing the cost by eliminating the activities which holds no value to the organization. But there are certain drawbacks to value proposition budgeting also. And these drawbacks can be understanding the value perspective of target audience is very difficult. How would you judge? How would you quantify that this kind of particular activity is valuable in nature? So problems may arise in understanding the right target audience. So that is why it is very important to actually find out the essence of that value in quantifiable terms also. Now coming to the other kind of technique of budgeting, that is the zero-based budgeting. Now this is based on the assumption that current year's budget has no reference with the previous year's budget. Usually in the corporate houses this kind of zero-based budgeting is used, but for NGOs this kind of budgeting may not be so useful, and it involves preparing a budget from the start or zero. Every expenditure needs to be justified, needs to be included in the budget. Only those expenses are allowed to be included which are considered highly essential for successful operation of the organization. So you see, only those expenses are allowed which are useful for the organization, but there are overhead expenses also. So it is very important to understand the concept of zero-based budgeting. This is how it tries to finalize a zero-based budgeting. Like analyzing these are the steps in zero-based budgeting, analyzing the cost of activity, then justifying the purpose of activity, trying to identify the alternative methods for the proposed activity, determining the consequence of not performing the activity, and decision regarding inclusion of activity. So this is the process of activity zero-based budgeting, and you have to analyze, you have to justify, you have to identify, you have to determine, and then make a decision whether this kind of budgeting is included, is to be prepared for the organization or not. These are some of the benefits of zero-based budgeting. It is highly effective for cost control. It leads to downsizing the cost and financial restructuring of the organization. It is quite efficient and effective for allocating the resources, and it is responsive to changes in business environment because it starts from the scratch, and that is why it is useful for certain kinds of organization. But there are certain drawbacks or disadvantages. It is only beneficial for organizations if they have high discretionary costs rather than essential operating costs. And it is a time-consuming approach, and managers may not have the required skills to justify the required activities. And it can lead to conflict amongst managers regarding inclusion of activities. And for NGOs, this might not be beneficial because they are not ready for the conflict amongst their employees. So at the organization, if the organization is very big, then this may work for those organizations. But if the organization is not so big, this kind of budgeting is not advisable. Now, this is all about different kinds of techniques related to the the organizations and the budgets required for NGOs, and we'll just stop here. And if you have any queries, you can always write to us, and hopefully you'll like this session. Thank you so much and happy learning.